Today I'm going to be talking about stochastic dynamics, focusing on continuous state systems described by Langevin and Fokker-Planck descriptions of motion. One of the big motivations of what we're going to be talking about today is biological systems. So in the video that I'm showing here, this is a rendering of ATP synthase, which is a remarkable molecular machine that lives in the mitochondrial membrane, which you might know as the powerhouse of the cell. Now what you might not know is why it is the powerhouse of the cell, and it's because of these guys. So these are tiny nanoscopic machines, so that's 10 to the minus 9 meters, that live in the mitochondrial membrane and synthesize these small molecules called ATP, essentially the main energy source for the cell. Now what we're going to be talking about today is how these small-scale systems live in an environment that's constantly fluctuating, getting bombarded by water molecules, and bouncing around. Here's another cool molecular machine that lives in the cell. So this is kinesin as it walks along a microtubule, obviously quite dramatized, but it carries around these very large cargoes. And once again, these don't live in an environment where things move deterministically. They live in sort of this stochastic environment, which basically just means that there's constant fluctuations bouncing it around at all times. Okay, and here's just a third example, which is sort of like the experimentally relevant realization. Here, these are microscopic beads, so 10 to the minus 6 meters, that can be trapped by a laser, which is called optical tweezers, and then you can very precisely manipulate them and move them around. So with these optical tweezers, this allows us to do actually really cool experiments. So here's a couple examples that I have, just cute little animations that I've made. So this is a DNA hairpin, which is on the length scale of nanometers. So it's a polymer, and what you can actually do is attach it between two beads, which are on the length scale of micrometers, so 10 to the minus 6 meters. Those are the exact same beads that I showed in the previous video. You can attach it between the two and then pull the beads apart in order to rip this DNA hairpin apart. Now, to move around the beads, they use something called optical tweezers, which you can use to basically trap the beads and move them around like I showed in the previous video. You can also do something cool with ATP synthase. Once again, that's the thing that I showed in the previous movie. You can actually take half of the motor, attach it to a cover slide, and then attach these beads once again to it, and then sort of spin them around with these magnetic optical tweezers to drive this system and produce or use up ATP. Okay, now one thing to know about things at this small length scale is they live in a very different environment. So here's a website from the University of Colorado where they have this cool introduction to gases, but we're going to actually use it for slightly different purposes. I'm going to add one heavy particle into this system. So you see this obeys sort of classical dynamics, it just sort of bounces around off the different walls. Now what's interesting is what happens if you add a lot of light particles in here. So if you add a few, they all just keep bouncing around. Let's keep going. Okay, now that I've added a bunch, what I want you to look at is just the blue particle as it moves around. So if you weren't able to see these red dots, or you imagine they were a lot smaller, if you only could see the motion of this blue dot, it would look like sort of it's just moving around randomly in this environment. And that's sort of what we mean when we talk about this stochastic dynamics. So dynamics kind of like this blue dot appear to obey if you can't see these red dots. So these all sorts of small water molecules bouncing around in the fluid that are going to hit these microscopic beads and sort of push it around. And a few other things that you can play with here. You can play with the temperature, so if you heat it up, you can see what happens. You can also cool it down and play around and see what happens. What kind of dependence do you see on its motion as you heat it up and cool it down? Okay, so that's a cool little simulation just to motivate a few different things, the type of dynamics that we expect to see here. Okay, now we're just going to do a quick little warm-up exercise based on diffusion of dye in water. This is to sort of get your brain working and get you in sort of learning mode. So here I've just dropped a colored dye into water from some height, and then it spreads out, and then it reaches some sort of slowing down as it spreads out. Now my question for you is how long should it take to diffuse 1 centimeter in water. Now I want to just talk about diffusion here, so we're going to assume the dye is identical to water, and I'll give you the diffusion coefficient for water. So if you really want to learn from this lesson, I recommend actually getting out your pen and paper or calculator and trying to figure out or think for yourself the time it would take to diffuse. Now, if you don't want to go through the calculation yourself, or you want to check your answer here, basically all I want you to do is do sort of this dimensional analysis. So very simple, quick calculation. These are the kinds of things that we do in physics all the time. So here I gave you the diffusion coefficient, which is in meters squared per second. I asked how long it takes to diffuse 1 centimeter, so you just convert centimeters into meters. And once you've converted centimeters into meters, you just solve for time. Just cancel out the units, and you find out that it actually takes about 14 hours for it to diffuse 1 centimeter. So that's really remarkable and something you might not expect. So that's a very long time scale. So actually what you're seeing in this video is not diffusion. It's actually some sort of combination, advection, convection, all sorts of other phenomena. And if you sort of look up about diffusing dye in water, you'll find all sorts of interesting things that are going on here. But I just wanted to emphasize the sort of time scales that are involved in diffusion. So they're very long time scales if you want to go macroscopic distances like centimeters. It only really has a major effect on short time scales. So that's the time scales that you'll diffuse. And that's why we're kind of talking about these microscopic systems, why they feel this so much more than we do at the macroscopic scale. So that's on the scale of like centimeters and meters. The next question, motivated by kind of the little simulation you could do on the PhET labs previously, is what happens if we increase temperature? So there's some famous relationships relating the diffusion coefficient to temperature and all sorts of other parameters. This is actually one of the things that Einstein himself was famous for. One of his papers in 1905 is about these relationships between Brownian motion and temperature. And basically, as you heat things up, it diffuses faster. So you could play around with these and try and see how hot it would have to be to diffuse a reasonable distance. And moving on to the more mathematical aspects of this, I'm going to talk about the Langevin equation. And I just want to ask you, what equations come to mind when you think of physics? So the answers that I typically get for this are, like I mentioned Einstein before, E equals mc squared. That's a common one. I've heard Schrodinger's equation. I've heard all sorts of different answers. But for me, the one that comes to mind as like the equation that you first start learning in physics is F equals ma. So force is equal to mass times acceleration. This is a classic, and this is actually all the Langevin equation is. So to get to the normal formulation of the Langevin equation, we're going to write the acceleration as the derivative of velocity, that's v, with respect to time t, which we can write as the second derivative of position as a function of time. Now the situation I'm going to have in mind here is like those beads I showed before dancing around. So here I have a purple bead. It's going to be immersed in a fluid, that's water. And then I'm going to trap it with a laser trap. And I can use that to kind of drag it around. My question is, what are the forces that would be involved in this system? And to sort of help you out with this, there's another simulation from the PhET labs once again, where you can play around with a lot of different cool things. So here's just a QR code that links to this website. It's the same website as we did the gas simulation before, so you should be able to find it that way. And there's a lot of cool things you can see here. So first of all, there's this yellow dot, and you can see it's kind of wiggling around. That's because it's in some sort of fluid, and they have this Brownian force enabled here. So that's the thing that makes it jiggle around. Okay, and then we also have this laser trap that's shown in red, and we can sort of adjust the power of this laser trap. So much stronger, we'll hold it more tightly, weaker, it'll sort of fly around. Okay, so you can play around with that. There's a lot of other cool things that you can play with over here. You can turn on what the electric field is actually doing. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on there that I'm not going to discuss today. You can also turn on some of these forces so you can actually see their magnitude and a lot of different things. You can plot the histogram of the position of the particle. So it tells you sort of where it's sitting. And you can also plot the potential energy curve. So this is related to the laser trap that holds it in one spot. Okay, so after you played around with that, try to think about what forces should be involved here, and I'm just going to tell you the ones that are going to come into our Langevin equation. So here, first of all, we have the force of friction. So if you imagine we move our laser trap around to drag this bead around, it's going to be moving through the fluid, so you're going to have some sort of viscous drag. So the force of friction is just the regular friction that you're familiar with. Let's say you're dragging a block along a table, same kind of friction. So it goes minus gamma, that's the drag coefficient, times the velocity. Okay, so regular viscous drag moving through a fluid. You also have this force from the potential, which can be either a laser potential, it could be under gravity if we're on the Earth, which can write as an external force, which is the gradient of some potential energy V. Okay, so that's all just regular classical dynamics. But the real weird thing in the Langevin equation is this random force. And what this comes from is from all these tiny water molecules constantly hitting this bead. So that's what causes the jiggling around. Now I want you to think about for a second what properties this random force should have. So the first one from what you could see in the previous simulation is that we want this random force to not move it around on average. So on average it should just stay in one spot. Another one relates to how much it jostles it around. And that, as we saw before, is going to have to be related to the temperature. So I'll just give you the specific details. So this random force is going to have some standard deviation sigma, and it's going to be labeled by this random number, psi of t. So this is what we call a random noise. It's dependent on time. And this here, sigma, is the standard deviation. Okay, so a couple properties. The average of psi of t is equal to 0, and in general I'm going to denote an average by these angled brackets. This is quite common notation. And then the other property, so on average it's 0, the other property is that its variance, or this is the auto covariance technically, is this delta function. And this is a bit of an assumption, but basically this is what we call Gaussian white noise. And the reason it's called Gaussian white noise is because it's a Gaussian distribution. That means it's defined by its mean and standard deviation. It just has those two moments, and that's kind of the bell curve that you'd be familiar with. And it's white noise because it has equal probability at all frequencies, just like white light. Okay, and that's what defines sort of this delta function, correlation function. So we have F equals ma. We're going to write it as ma equals F, and then we plug in all the different forces I just talked about. So acceleration, remember, is the derivative of velocity. We have the gradient of our potential energy. We have this viscous drag term, as well as this random forcing term. So just mentioning again the properties that I mentioned before, zero mean, and it has this delta function correlated noise. And then if you want to know the position of the particle, you can just get that from the velocity by solving this equation. Basically just integrating the velocity over time tells you where it is. This is what we call, this is the Langevin equations for the velocity and position. But if our mass is low or viscosity is high, then this actually simplifies to Brownian motion. So this corresponds actually a lot to the examples that I showed before. So like these microscopic beads in water, their mass is quite low, so they have very little inertia. Basically what this means is that once they move, they will, if they're not being pushed on, they will stop almost instantaneously. So this makes sense with the viscosity being high or its mass being low. Okay, so in this approximation, basically we can ignore this first term, which has a mass on it, and write the velocity in terms of the position. And what we end up with is this equation here, and this is the famous equation for Brownian motion. Okay, so this is a much simpler equation. Basically because we don't have to deal with the velocities anymore, we can just deal strictly in terms of position, and it turns out to be a very good description of motion for these microscopic systems as well as these biological systems. So now that we have the Langevin equation, what we're going to look into is actually solving this equation. So what I've described here for now actually depends on this random noise. So every time you do an individual trajectory, like I just showed there, it's going to have random realizations. That's because of this psi of t term. So every time you evolve the dynamics, you're going to get a different result. But one interesting thing to look at is what happens on average. Okay, so here, once again denoting the average by angle brackets, we can look at our Brownian motion that we just had and sort of look at the averages of these quantities. So here, when we look at the average of this random noise, we defined it to be 0 before, remember that. So then we get for the average position of the system that the motion basically just obeys regular classical dynamics, moving down the gradient in the energy landscape. Okay, so that makes sense for the average. Now, to look at the variance, which is the second moment of the distribution, we're going to simplify the equation a little bit and just let the energy equal to 0, or that at least the gradient of the energy has to be equal to 0. And in this case, we can actually solve the equation just like we would for a regular differential equation. This is just the problem set up the way it is just a standard ordinary differential equation, which you can solve very readily because there's no dependence on x on the right-hand side as long as you don't have a potential. This can also be solved for very simple potentials like linear and quadratic energies. But anyways, what we're looking at here is the solution for the position as a function of time. Basically, we just integrated the right-hand side of the equation. And here we have the position. It depends on whatever your initial position was, which is often a random variable as well. It moves along according to this random driving force. So this is also a random variable. So this whole equation is random variables. Okay, and then you integrate that up to whatever time you're looking at. Okay, now to look at sort of different properties of the distribution, we can look at the square of the position. And this is going to get at the variance in a few seconds. So this is just me squaring the equation. But what's interesting is we're going to look at averages now. So if we take the average of the left-hand side, we take the averages of the right-hand side as well. This first term here is just the average variance in the position initially. So if you start with, let's say, like a delta function, then this would be 0. If you start with some sort of Gaussian distribution, a bell curve, then this will have like a well-defined variance at the beginning. And then we have a couple more terms here. So the second term here, the only random variables in there are this psi of t prime and psi of t double prime. And if you remember from our definitions, this is defined to be this sort of delta function correlation. And then once we integrate over time, sort of this delta function goes to 1, and then we integrate over time again, and we just get a function of time. Okay, so this term is relatively easy to deal with as well. And then this last term, you actually get a correlation between your initial positions, which is a random variable, as well as your random force at time t prime integrated up to t. And we assume these are not correlated. So your initial position distribution is uncorrelated from your random noise. So then solving this for the variance of your position distribution, basically you get whatever your variance was initially, plus some variance that increases over time. And here we have it written in terms of the variance of your noise distribution, that's sigma squared, and gamma squared here. And then it increases over time. And then using what we know how the variance should increase over time, you can relate this to the diffusion coefficient. So basically it's your initial position distribution and 2 times this diffusion coefficient, which increases in time. So this gives us a couple different relationships between our diffusion coefficient and the standard deviation of our noise term that I just defined before as being a property of it. So the standard deviation we now find is related to 2 times the viscosity of your material, so this damping coefficient squared, times this diffusion coefficient. And you can write this diffusion coefficient, which I mentioned at the very beginning, related to Boltzmann's constant, Kb, temperature, and this gamma. So that's an equation I mentioned at the beginning. And then you can also then use that to relate this standard deviation of your random noise to temperature. So this now connects back to sort of the picture we had at the beginning by using this sort of fluctuation dissipation relation, that's this d equals kBt over gamma, to connect the magnitude of our random Gaussian noise that we've added to our Langevin equation to temperature. So higher temperature means noisier system means larger random forces acting on your microscopic bead. So that's one approach to analytically solve the Langevin equation. What can actually be more useful and can be quite quick is solving it numerically, and then you can look at specific stochastic trajectories. So here, this is the equation once again where we have the velocity, so not the Brownian dynamics, but the full Langevin dynamics. And a simple method to solve this is to use a numerical solution using Euler's method. There's just a few different things here. So this psi here is a random number from a normal distribution. This is Python code, and it has 0 mean and variance 2 gamma kt times your time step. Okay, so that's related to the standard deviation. That's why there's a square root here. Then you just sort of update your dynamics in a simple Euler time step. And you can do something similar for the Brownian dynamics, but now we have a slightly simpler equation to update the dynamics. So here I've assumed there's no potential energy. So here is a trinket. Basically what I have here is in this top QR code. If you go to this link, this is to a GitHub page where I have this code that's copied in here. And then this second QR code, this is only if you don't have Python installed on your computer. This is just a website that you can use to run Python. Okay, so this is just a simple script that outputs a couple different things. Basically just does the dynamics that I just showed on the previous slide. And there's a few different things you can look at here. So you can play around with the different parameters and stuff like that, but if you just sort of run it by clicking this play button, you'll see a graph show up on the right, and we'll show sort of one trajectory of these random dynamics. So we have position on the vertical axis, time on the horizontal axis, two different curves. So the black curve is the underdamped dynamics, so that's the one where we have velocities, and the red dashed line is this Brownian dynamics. So that's where we don't have the velocities, and we sort of assume the mass is low or the damping coefficient is high. Now what I would like you to play around with is actually changing some of these parameters. In particular, you can play around with the mass and this damping coefficient and see what happens. So for example, you could make your damping coefficient very high, let's say 10 times larger than I had it originally, and then see what happens. Basically what you see is that this sort of Brownian dynamics much more closely matches the underdamped dynamics, so the velocity dependent dynamics, as you increase the damping coefficient. I will mention that you do have to be a bit careful with your time stepping and your total time to make sure that you're not taking too big of a time step for your dynamics. And you don't want to run into numerical issues. So that's just some code for you to play around with, have some fun with, and you can solve the Langevin equation yourself here in Python with just a few lines of code, very simple update rules. Okay, and then to just get to a bit more complicated of a system that I'll just allow you to play around with as well. Here's some more code that I have that does two-dimensional, but now I have an energy landscape, which is here at the top with its gradient, and this is the Brownian dynamics, so no velocities, and it does the dynamics of the system as it moves around in 2 dimensions. So if you run it, basically you'll get a trajectory of a particle which goes from this white dot and ends on this sort of purple dot here, and it follows this black curve. And what you can play around with here, I mean, you can play around with anything you want, but one thing that's kind of fun is to play with this KT parameter, so that's your thermal energy, so that's the Boltzmann constant times temperature. You can increase it and see what happens. So now you see as you increase it, you kind of go between different energy wells. Energy goes from blue to red, being low energy to high energy. And you sort of get all sorts of cool dynamics. This is just something for you to play around with as well and sort of get a feel for how these dynamics work and what sort of goes into these calculations. Okay, and then if you do these calculations, here's another code snippet where you have basically I've added in time-dependent temperature, so that it starts off hot and sort of cools down, and I've made a video of the actual particle moving around, which is shown in red. So this is some more code that you can try out yourself as well. Basically, as you cool the system down, it goes down into one of these energy wells shown in dark blue or purple, and eventually gets trapped in one of these energy wells, and sort of the simulation ends. Okay, cool. Now you have all the tools to do the kind of research that I was just showing on the previous slides, but this is just for individual trajectories. What we might be interested in instead is in the probability distribution. So it's not always efficient to run individual trajectories if you're interested in like average properties or the sort of statistical properties of the system rather than individual single trajectories, so just one particle moving around. Instead we want like thousands of them. What you can do is you could simulate a lot of trajectories, and you can actually do that with the code that I showed before. Especially the two-dimensional one is set up pretty well for running like 100 or 1,000 particles at the same time. But that's not always the most efficient. So instead, we might look at just the probability distribution. This is P of x and t. So here is just an example of what your probability distributions might look like under these types of dynamics. So if we have Brownian dynamics, our probability, P, as a function of position, x, and time, t. Let's say we start with some distribution that looks like this. As you evolve the system, what we know about Brownian motion is that the system will tend to spread out. So the probability distribution will spread out. So at the beginning, you're likely to find it in your initial spot, and then over time, you're more likely to find it further and further away, and eventually it will go to sort of this uniform distribution. So if there's no energy in the energy landscape in the system, it just goes to a flat distribution. That's what we call a uniform distribution. So that's what to expect from your probability distributions. And just to introduce a few different properties of these probability distributions. First of all, probability distributions are always non-negative. So this P of x of t is always greater than or equal to 0. This makes intuitive sense. There isn't really meaning to negative probabilities. Another property is that the probability always sums to 1. This basically just means that you always have probability 1 of finding it somewhere. So you might not know where your particle is, but it's somewhere in this space if you include all of space, basically integrating over all positions. And this has to be true at all times. Okay, and then another useful property is how to calculate averages, which I was calling these angle brackets before. Now I'm actually getting into quantifying exactly what I mean by these angle brackets. So what I mean, if for a continuous distribution, is that this integral of the quantity you're interested in, a of x and possibly t, averaged over p of x and t. So this is how you would calculate averages for a continuous probability distribution, continuous space. And you can do similar ones for discrete ones, but today we're just focusing on continuous systems. Okay, so those are the important properties you need to know for probability distributions. Now we're going to actually get into what's known as the Fokker-Planck equation, specifically for Brownian dynamics. And it has this form. So this is a pretty complicated looking equation, so we're going to break it down a little bit. So the first thing to note is that instead of x, I now have this bold r. This just means that I'm talking about three-dimensional space now instead of one-dimensional, just to write it down more generally. Okay. Often you will see the probability written in this form rather than the form I have at the top. Essentially what this means is that you have your probability distribution at position r and t, at time t, and it's conditioned on r naught and t naught, so some initial position and some initial time. Basically, in the context of this Fokker-Planck equation, what this means is you solve this equation at the top with an initial condition, which is pretty standard practice for solving differential equations. So this basically tells you that your probability distribution is conditioned on some initial condition. Okay, so I'm just going to drop the conditional probability most of the time, but if you see it, that's what it means. Okay, so expanding out these brackets, these operators actually act on everything to the right. You end up with a few different terms. So left-hand side is your dynamics of probability distribution, how it changes in time. The first term here is your drift term, so it's related to this gamma, this damping coefficient, and the sort of gradient of your force and your probability distribution. And in one dimension, this is quite simple. It's just the gradient with respect to position. And the second term is sort of the diffusion term. So the first term relates to basically moving down the energy landscape. Like, let's say you have a laser, it moves to the middle of the laser trap. If you have gravity, you move down in gravity. The second term is this diffusion term, which kind of comes from this random noise, and sort of describes how the distribution kind of spreads out over time. Okay, so in one dimension, this is just the second derivative with respect to position, this del squared. Okay, you might see this equation written out in a few different forms. Here's just a few different ways of writing it, which are fairly common, just so you're familiar with them if you see them. So the top way is sort of with all the operators on the left. Then sort of if we expand it a little bit, you end up with the second equation, and you can sort of reorder things as well to end up with this third equation. Each one can be useful in different contexts depending on what you're looking at. Okay, so one important property of our Fokker-Planck equation is related to the equilibrium of the system. So what equilibrium means is basically what your system will evolve to over long times, or the state that it will reach once it stops changing. So for our definition of equilibrium, basically we just take this left-hand side, this probability distribution changing as a function of time, equal to 0. So it sort of gives you kind of a steady state or equilibrium solution for probability distribution. And then sort of a more subtle condition is that we actually also require this probability flux, so this del dot, this term in the middle. This term in the inside relates to the flux of probability, which also has to be 0 at equilibrium, which helps with us finding the equilibrium solution. So because this term inside the brackets has to be 0, we can just equate the two sides. So this first term equal to the second term, so they will exactly cancel out, and that's the equation that we get here. So this sort of diffusive term matches this drift term. And then because we're looking at equilibrium, it's going to be independent of time. So now I'm going to drop the time dependence on all these variables. And I'm also going to write the force as the gradient of the potential. And we'll see why in a second. Okay, and it's also useful to write this diffusion coefficient. This is just to get a nice looking equation at the end, which relates sort of some interesting properties together. We're going to write it in the other form, so this kBt over gamma, or 1 over beta gamma. So beta is commonly used as inverse temperature. It's just 1 over Boltzmann's constant times temperature. So that's how we're going to write this diffusion coefficient here. These are just equations I talked about at the beginning. Okay, so we're just going to do this in one dimension to solve this, but it generalizes quite easily to multiple dimensions. And I'm going to rearrange things a little bit. So here I have the gradient of the probability, that's just the derivative with respect to x on the left-hand side, gradient of the potential on the right-hand side. This beta comes from this relationship with the diffusion coefficient. And I've moved this probability over to the left-hand side. So just simple rearrangements for there. And then the important step is this next step. And what you can actually do is write this derivative on the left-hand side as the derivative of the log of the probability, because we know that the derivative of the log gives 1 over the function, right? So you can kind of think about this working backwards. If you do this derivative, you end up with the previous equation. That should make sense. And on the right-hand side, I just kept the same. And now we're left with sort of one of the only differential equations that I know how to solve. Very simple. Basically, we have our function on the left, and on the right-hand side, we just have something that doesn't depend on our function on the left. So basically, we just integrate both sides of the equation, and we end up with our solution for the probability distribution as a function of x is related to this potential energy. So here, it's normalized by this factor z, which actually turns out to be the partition function. And this exponential here, this is actually what's known as the Boltzmann factor. So if you're familiar with statistical mechanics, we know that this is the Boltzmann distribution. So that's awesome. We have this Fokker-Planck equation, and it's sort of designed in this way, but it's really nice that it gives out this Boltzmann distribution, so we know it obeys sort of equilibrium statistical properties that we expect from like statistical mechanics, thermodynamics, that sort of thing. So that's really cool. Moving on to a few different examples and exercises to get a feel for how this Fokker-Planck equation works. Let's just take a simple potential, so a linear potential. So your force is just minus c, this basically the strength of the force, and we can solve this sort of analytically. So here's our Fokker-Planck equation in one dimension, x, with this specific potential and force. Okay, so now's your chance to try and solve this. I need to also give you initial conditions. So we're going to assume delta function initial conditions at some position x0. And first I want you to think, what do you expect to happen? And this is very helpful in general with solving physics problems, because then you can kind of compare your final answer and see if it makes sense. So let's imagine we have our position x on the horizontal axis. Vertical axis, I'm going to have a probability as a function of position and time. So here's x0, here's 1, here's our initial distribution. So it's all concentrated at x0 initially. And then here's our potential. So we have a linear potential energy that goes up as a function of x. So it looks something like this. Now the question is, what do you expect to happen to the probability distribution? Okay. So now that you've thought about that a little bit, the next steps to sort of do some sanity checks would be to find the average position as a function of x and t. So try and solve for this equation. Also try and solve for the standard deviation. And a couple hints to do this is basically you take this Fokker-Planck equation on the top, and to find the average position, for example, you multiply by x. And remember, x doesn't explicitly depend on time, and then integrate over all x on both the left-hand side and the right-hand side. And then once you have a feel for how to do that, you can do similar things for this standard deviation here. Okay, and then once you've found those can kind of give you some intuition for what you expect, but you can, for this system, actually solve for the entire probability distribution as a function of x and t. Here's a couple hints that you might need. So a couple properties of the probability distribution. We actually need to assume that the probability goes to 0 at plus and minus infinity. Basically, there's no probability of finding the particle infinitely far from where you started. And we also require that the derivative of the probability at plus and minus infinity also goes to 0. This is just required to actually solve this system. Okay. And now that you have intuition for how the distribution goes, here's just straight out of Wikipedia a little simulation of how the probability distribution evolves over time for this system. And now that you've had a chance to look at it, here's the actual solution. And if you're interested how to find the solution, you can actually find it straight on the Wikipedia for the Fokker-Planck equation, which I recommend reading through. It's a fairly straightforward derivation once you know a couple little tricks. Okay, now we've gone through and learned all about the Langevin and Fokker-Planck equation, and on a final note, I just want to relate some of the things that you've learned about today, so some of the research that I've done. So this is just to show you that these kind of dynamics and equations that you were able to solve today and run simulations of these dynamics, these can actually go into modern physics research. So here's some work that I did, a little video which is also on my YouTube channel, relating to ATP synthase and sort of modeling how it would be optimally driven around in circles, basically. And the dynamics that I use are sort of described by these sort of Fokker-Planck dynamics, and the simulations are actually run with these Langevin simulations that I kind of showed before. So you kind of see this bead moving around this energy landscape around in a circle is very similar to the types of dynamics that I described today. So now with what you've learned today, you too can do this type of research, and you can do all sorts of cool calculations and play around with these types of systems, and hopefully learn a lot more about these small-scale stochastic systems. Thank you for listening.